From looking at the data, it turns out, and it's not surprising at all, that when we're in a world where people are spending more time at home, that they're finding ways to entertain themselves and amuse themselves, and more people are turning to video games. So we actually experienced a spike in video game playing, and all the data supports this. Like, it's super anomalous. Usually, the summer is the lowest point in the consumption and both measured by both purchase and playing of video games. Which, some people think, well, that's when students have their time off. Maybe they play more video games, but it turns out that in the summer times we tend to, and of course we have two hemispheres, so summer is different up top of it. But it turns out, especially when we look at premium games, the kinds of games you play on an Xbox or a PlayStation or a Nintendo Switch, the kinds of games that we consider traditional video games, these tend to be played more in the upper hemisphere, where summer is in the months of May through August, depending on how you want to measure it. But usually this is a pit. There's two reasons for this. One, people get out more and they travel and they explore, and two, the average customer is actually they're not just children going to school. In fact, for our Borderlands game, the average age of our players is 36 years old, which surprises a lot of people to hear that aren't actively engaged in video games. That's the average age, which means that half of our players are older than that. And we don't have any players. It's technically an M-rated game. We shouldn't have any players below 17, but we don't really have any players that are below the age of 10, 11, 12. It's tiny fractions at that point. But we have lots of players that are in their 70s, and that's interesting, right? So the age is skewing older, and people get out in the summer, and so they're not playing video games. But this summer we saw the opposite. In the summer of 2020, we saw a huge spike and a second bell curve in the middle of the year where it's usually a valley. And in fact, from a sales perspective, it was actually greater than what we experienced during the holiday seasons, which is traditionally, when people are buying Christmas gifts and staying indoors for their breaks over the holidays. This is usually the biggest peak, but we felt basically a second Christmas in summer in the marketplace, and that was really, really surprising. But not really when you think about it in hindsight, and you think about what the behavior is of the people. So there's that component, and that created a huge increase in demand for content, because people are consuming more content. And to counter that, how do we create more supply? Because at the exact same time that demand was spiking, the entire game industry, in terms of how the processes it used to create, was shifting from an environment where many of us, maybe most, are used to working very closely with each other in studio facilities and collaborating face to face on a daily basis. And we shifted from that mode into a complete work from home mode. And that's a dramatic adaptation, especially for an industry that depends upon so much collaboration. Unfortunately, we have tools like the one we're using right now to interact, so that made it a little bit easier. But it was quite an adaptation, and a lot of folks are still struggling with it, and we're seeing a lot of pressure put on the demand side of the industry, which is tricky, especially if you're an artist like me, if you're a creator, that tends to be in the critical path of delivering the product, and delivering the content, and delivering the software that makes this all work. We as an industry have been working very hard to fight this idea of crunch, and now we have more pressure than ever to crunch, and some studios are succumbing to that pressure, and it's heartbreaking.